as we are now barely 2 months out from the entrance of the second Trump administration. Issues with the Russia-Ukraine war are taking on more and more prevalence. A lot of people are paying even more attention. I actually ever have since the election was held, and it was clear that Trump was the unequivocal winner. And now everybody's been paying a lot of attention to a lot of his cabinet picks because, as they say, personnel is policy. And so when you're talking about what Trump's going to do, it's really important to know who he's got on his staff that are going to try to make this into a reality. But then we also have to look at the other half of the equation, and that is from the Russian side, or even in the Russia and the Ukraine side as well. Those are additional players that have to be taken into consideration. And we're going to do all that today to see if we can find out, is Trump going to bring his famous brand of deal making into play and reach a negotiated settlement, or is Vladimir Putin going to play to his strengths and win a military victory? To help us uncover some of this and to illuminate some very interesting things, we have back to the show Colonel Jacques Baud, one of our all-time favorites on here. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Nice to be back with you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Always our pleasure. Listen, I'm just curious right off the top of the bat, what in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war and America's lead in it, you've had the current administration that's been going in a certain direction that we talk about a lot when we've had you on the show. And then if Harris had won, it probably would have just been a perpetuation of the status quo. But when Trump got elected, I wonder what your initial thoughts were of to what, if anything, that might change in the course of the war.
Well, obviously, Trump is willing to not to solve the issue, in fact. He just wants to disengage United States from this conflict. I mean, he has a mere economic view on that conflict. It's not about peace. It's not about love with Russia. It's about the black hole that this conflict has become. So he wants to disengage. And in fact, what he wants to do, and that's why you have a panic here in Europe, is that what Trump wants is to give the baby to the Europeans. And the problem is that the Europeans have not the capability nor the financial resources and military resources, by the way, to support the Ukraine in the long run. Meaning that soon or later, you will have to find a political solution or a solution on the ground. And that's where the whole question arises. But obviously, Trump wants to concentrate on other issues such as China and probably the Middle East, I don't know, but certainly China. And therefore, Ukraine has to be abandoned to the Europeans. I think that's the problem.
Well, now let me zero in on that part about the Europeans, especially because every time we have you on the show and we talk about, we inevitably get around to the ground truth reality, and we're going to do that again today as well. But when you look at the fundamentals of warfare, which you have just been eloquently propounding from the beginning, there is no path, never has been one, for a Ukraine victory. Now then, it's increasingly unlikely they can even hang on for much longer. So when the Europeans are talking about they're concerned about the support for the war, do they have in mind an end state?
Well, that's the problem, because as we know, as I said, Trump wants to leave. Okay, fine. But the problem is that the Europeans still talk about possible victory. I mean, and that's totally delusional, because first of all, it has never been defined. I mean, what can be considered as a victory for Ukraine? That's the first point. And secondly, the problem is, how do you want to achieve that with the existing resources? Because obviously, and we see that Ursula von der Leyen has been recently to Kiev to explain that the loan that was originally planned for Ukraine cannot be achieved, that Europe wanted to fund that loan by itself to Ukraine, but in fact, they cannot afford that. So, and you know the economic situation of Germany. Germany is more and more in favor of a political solution, because obviously Germany cannot afford to fund. And in fact, this is also the reason why you had this recent clash between Olaf Scholz and his finance minister, because obviously Germany acknowledged that it cannot support in the with billions of euro this war. On the French side, this is exactly the same situation, that France is almost bankrupt, and we are in a situation where none of the major countries in Europe can sustain a funding and military supply and support to Ukraine. So what is victory about? We don't know that, but people still, they are delusional. They still speak about it. And even Zelensky himself, because recently Zelensky just said that what he wants are not negotiations, but weapons. And I have here just to show this this picture on the that he had on Ukrainska Pravda. So it's not about negotiation, it's about weapons. So he still thinks that he can achieve something with his armed forces. And that's where the thing becomes extremely bizarre, because if you look at it from a military point of view, you don't really understand what could be achievable as what you could call a victory.
You know, that's reminiscent of what he said famously in the first hours of the war, when he said famously, I don't need a ride out of town, I need bullets, etc. So everybody's like, yeah, that's really cool. But to say it now, nearing the 3-year mark, when your country is literally falling apart and your armed forces are fraying to the point of potentially breaking, to say, I don't want negotiations, I want more weapons. Wow, that's hard to understand.
There is a difference, though, because just at the beginning of the conflict, the idea was, with sanctions and embargoes and with its isolation of Russia, to achieve the collapse of what the West calls the regime. I mean, that was the idea. And in fact, that's the reason why in the first weeks and probably the first days, because Zelensky noticed very quickly that he couldn't fight very long. And that's the reason why on one day after the beginning of the Russian operation, Zelensky called the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs to arrange a peace conference. But nevertheless, they still considered that they could achieve some kind of victory by making the Russian system to collapse, the economy to collapse, and then to have some kind of popular uprising or whatever, so that you would have a change at the top of the Russian government. The problem is that since 2022, we have noticed that this cannot work. That on the contrary, Russia has reinforced itself. Its economy has been strengthened. Its the military-industrial complex is more active than ever. It's producing more weapons than ever, and therefore the idea of making the system collapse is no longer actual. Meaning that what Zelensky says today is totally delusional. I mean, we could have understood that 3 years ago, but today it's totally delusional.
Now, probably speaking of delusion, that headline that Gary's got on the screen right there, I just wonder what your thoughts were on that, especially in light of what you just said about how way a lot of the Europeans are viewing this issue right now, about support and equipment and ammunition and all that kind of stuff. And you see that Blinken is trying to get a one last rush of support to Ukraine before Trump takes office. Now, certainly they have the capacity. They still have, a couple of months plus of time left, and they can get, they can surge a bunch of things in there, a bunch of ammunition and even weapon systems. But towards what end? What is the objective and the purpose of this surge?
Well, first of all, we have to question whether a surge is is even possible, because I mean I live in Belgium and in Brussels, and recently the Ministry of Defense here in Brussels has declared that they don't have any more ammunition. I mean artillery ammunition. So now the Belgian government has a credit of 7 billion euros to buy weapons for the Belgian army, because the Belgian army has, in fact, completely depleted its own stock to send them to Ukraine. So, and apparently, we have a similar situation in France and in other European countries, meaning that we are very much at the very limit of any European capabilities, and we see that France has tried to resurrect some production line for ammunition and some artillery, but this still takes time until you have the necessary investments to do that, and until you have the full production capacity. So I think again Blinken is. I think he's overestimating the reserves and the capacities of the European armies. They have given almost everything they have. This is the problem.
Yeah, it is, and trying to throw a few more. I mean, it just seems like trying to say, all right, I'm going to make one more chance to put this house fire out with a cup of water. We'll just throw it on and see if that works. I mean, I think it's has about the same amount of chance of success. Okay, so that's the outgoing administration. Now let's shift gears a little bit to the incoming. Now, just to remind all of our folks here, back in, I think it was May of 2023, that's when Trump first said, hey, I'm going to end the war in Europe if I get, or in between Russia and Ukraine, if I get elected.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It will be settled quickly. I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order. And it will take me no longer than one day. I know exactly what to say to each of them.
Now, of course, that was always hyperbole to suggest it would be in one day, but he could reasonably say, when I enter office, I'm going to come starting on day one with an attempt to reach a negotiated solution. Now, as I said a minute ago, there's multiple sides to this conversation. So really the most important next one is, what would Putin say? And here's what he said just a couple of days ago.
What he said about his desire to rebuild relations with Russia, to facilitate an end to the Ukrainian crisis. I think this deserves attention at the very least. And if he does what he has been promising, before the inauguration, if he makes a phone call, if he says, Vladimir, let's meet, I don't think it would be beneath me to call him myself.
Now, as I said, that the title of this episode here is, can Trump win a negotiated settlement, or will Putin win a conventional military victory on the ground? I think it's fair to say that, based on things you have said before, that Putin does have the capacity to win a military solution. But I want your view on, to what extent does he have motivation to seek a negotiated settlement?
Well, I think, first of all, obviously, when you have a negotiation, you have two parties at least. And the word negotiations is not understood in the same way by the Russians and by the West and by the Ukrainians, by the way. So Putin has, on the 14th of June, he has declared his preconditions to enter negotiation. To enter negotiation, not for the negotiation, just to enter negotiation. And namely, that was to have the four oblasts, so Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, to be part of Russia, period. So no discussion about to whom that belonged to Russia, period. And second precondition is that Ukraine declares that it will not join NATO. So these are the two preconditions. And based on that, then you can have a negotiation. But those 2 points needs to be accepted even beforehand. While if you go on the Ukrainian side, if you look at what Zelensky said, first of all, he said that he doesn't want negotiations in terms of negotiation to achieve peace. What Zelensky wants is a negotiations on the implementation of his 10 points formula, peace formula. And that's what he said. If you have here this this article from the Kyiv Independent, by the way, it's a document of today, where he said that the idea of having an exchange of land for security or land for NATO or things like this, this is not what Zelensky wants. He wants land, period, and he doesn't want an exchange. So, and he, in this article of the Kyiv Independent, it noted Kyiv has insisted that the peace settlement should be based on President Volodymyr Zelensky 10-point peace formula, which include the restoration of full territorial integrity. And I remind you that this peace formula is, in essence, a capitulation declaration by the Russians.
Right, right. Yeah, that's more like we're asking you to surrender as you're closing in on us.
Well,
wow.
That's totally, you see, we are totally disconnected from any type of realistic solution. And it's, and the, on the European side, the Europeans said, I mean, now they tend to accept the idea of a discussion, but so far they said it's no way we talk to Putin. So you have the US who said, well, we can probably talk. And in fact, the US, especially the Pentagon, is pressing Zelensky to open talks with Russia since early November 2022. And so US is probably more open to some type of negotiations. The question will be on what, and we will discuss that later. But
right. That's the issue.
And by the way, a negotiation, and Zelensky doesn't. And we have to remember that if you look at the map, I mean, how can you avoid the fact that any discussion or any negotiation can't be by Russian terms? So the Russians are the key element of that negotiation, but nobody talks about it. And that's where I have doubt about Trump's
his intentions, yeah, what he wants to get done. For those who may not have seen it, I think it's really instructive to actually see when Putin was talking about that on June 14th, and note his body language and his confidence in his voice when he's making these comments.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
Yeah, that's, and he reiterated there, said it just what you said a minute ago, that is the preconditions to begin negotiations. He didn't say, hey, let's negotiate and here's what I'd like to have the outcome. He said, once these conditions exist, then we'll have a conversation. And according to you, he has the wherewithal to hold that position.
Well, and in fact, his position is not completely unrealistic. I mean, first of all, because if you look on the ground, he holds the ground. I mean, that's the first aspect. He has almost the greater part of those four regions that he mentioned. As to the neutrality, this is probably one of the most contentious aspects. But if you think about it, this is what Ukraine had in its constitution in 1991. Until it amended the constitution later in the year 2000. But in the beginning, when it came to existence, when Ukraine became independent, it had in its constitution the fact that it would not belong to any military alliance, and it would not allow to have foreign troops on its territory. The word neutrality is not mentioned in that constitution, but in fact, it comes to the same in the sense that it's acknowledged that there will be no foreign presence on Ukraine territory. And that's in essence what the Russians want today. So in fact, that would be just a return to the Constitution of 1991. So this is not completely unachievable, if you want. If you look at a mere, let's say, technical or legal point. The problem is that, of course, that would imply that Crimea would be definitely considered as Russian, as well as the 4 regions. And that's probably the most contentious part, at least for the Europeans, because the Europeans are very keen in saying that the borders cannot be modified in Europe, although they accepted the borders to be modified in Kosovo. But
yeah. It just depends on which borders I think we're talking about.
Exactly.
So I'm just curious, though, again, from the European perspective, they see the map. They see that graph that Gary had up there a second ago in the New York Times, which was showing the increasing rapidity of the territory. Each of these bars is square kilometers taken by the Russian side, and you see it's just on this continued uphill swing. And once they get November in here, that goes through October. I imagine it's going to continue on the same trend. They got to see that if you don't have negotiations, those trends are likely going to hold. And at some point, the Ukraine side is just going to be militarily defeated. I can't imagine that they would like to see that outcome. But don't they then have to, at some point, come to the recognition you're just not going to get anything rolled back? So why keep going down a path that could lead in complete disaster?
Well, that's a strange thing. This is this kind of denial of the reality that you have in the European leadership. I mean, with the exception of Viktor Orban in Hungary, right, and Fico in Slovakia, of course, and probably some other politicians who start to understand the reality on the ground. If you look at the map, and probably I can show you these maps, which are probably indicative of the problem here, and that's the evolution of the Ukrainian territory since 2014. And had Ukraine respected the minorities and with the law and all that, that's the map that we have today. So this is the first map. Now they didn't respect, so we go to the Minsk Accords. If they had agreed or respected the Minsk Accord, that would be the map today. If they had accepted the agreement in the first round of the negotiation, that would be just the part that would belong to, let's say, those 2 republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk Republic. If they had accepted the agreement of Istanbul, that would be the situation today. That means a neutral Ukraine and the 2 republics. Well, the status should be discussed. And then you have the preconditions of Vladimir Putin of June 2024, to what we just mentioned. That means all the 4 regions to Russia and a neutral country. Now, what we are heading to, and that's where the behavior of the Western leadership becomes very bizarre, because where we are heading to, in fact, is a situation such as this one, where suddenly the Russians start to take over probably Odessa or something like that, or maybe even further in the direction of the Dnieper region. And finally, probably what we can call the decisive victory, that would be the whole eastern part of Ukraine being taken over by the Russians and the rest of Ukraine being neutral. I don't expect the Russians to go to the western part of Ukraine, because this is the more nationalistic, where you could have very much difficulties. That's where you had a lot of guerrilla warfare in the until up to the early 60s, with the support of CIA and the MI6 and the DGSE, the French SDEC at the time. That was the SDEC. And they supported insurgent movements in the western part of Ukraine. So I think the Russians don't want to repeat this experience, and that's the different scenario we can have. The problem is that nobody in Europe seems to be aware of that possibility, and that sounds very strange to me. But again, we are with a leadership which is extremely delusional, and that was exactly the same since the very beginning of this conflict, because everybody expected to be able to destroy Russia just with sanctions, meaning that apparently the underestimation of Ukrainian capabilities and capacities is striking. And but we are still in that mood, because you still have politicians. I very recently heard a French politician saying that it's still possible to win over Russia. Now,
Wow.
how you can do that? How you can achieve that? Politically, I mean, economically, I don't see exactly how, but that's the reason why they keep applying new sanction packages, and they want now to strengthen the existing sanctions against Russia. But Russia has completely turned away from Europe, is completely in the direction of China and Asia, and I don't see how economic sanctions can still be effective against Russia. And militarily, we discussed that already. There is absolutely no perspective here to achieve any decisive. Probably Ukraine can repeat an operation such as the Kursk one and take over some square kilometers, probably, but more than this, I don't expect that.
Yeah, yeah, and that's even increasingly at risk. But listen, I think that series of maps you just showed there is one of the more profound graphics I have ever seen in this war, because it graphically depicts how the failure of the Western world to acknowledge ground truth reality has cost the Ukrainian people and nation at every turn. And if we don't turn things around, and if the Trump administration doesn't take advantage of the opportunity, then those last couple on your screen become increasingly probable. I would even go so far as to say. But now here we got a problem, because it's one thing for Putin to say, yeah, sure, come on, I'd be willing to talk. And for the President Trump to say, yeah, and I want to talk, let's get that in. But as Alex, our friend at History Legends, said in a video he released yesterday, there are some additional problems.
There's a very good chance that Putin outright refuses. For him, it's not the Americans that will dictate the outcome of the Ukraine war, because from his perspective, this war is being fought on Russia's terms only. We have to remember that the Russians are highly suspicious regarding tables of negotiations and plans involving freezing the front. The ceasefires of 2014 and 2015 led nowhere. Actually, it helped Ukraine become heavily militarized. Then the Russians have been fooled by the peace talks in the spring of 2022. And from that point, we could say the Rubicon has been crossed. Even this summer, when Zelensky spoke of peace, the Russians let their guard down and Ukraine launched an offensive right into Russia. Let's just say the Russians have had their fair share of peace talks, tables of negotiations, and ceasefire agreements.
So then the question is, we often talk about here in the West that how could we have a negotiation? How could we trust Russia? But no one stops to think about, how can Russia trust us? And it is absolutely critical that you have to have some level of trust, even with an adversary, if you're ever going to reach any kind of negotiated settlement.
Well, you're right. I tend to disagree a little bit with what History Legend said, because the problem are not the Americans. In fact, the Americans might be the solution. In fact, the problem is that it's twofold for the Russians. First of all, they need to have a legitimate partner in the discussion, and the problem is that Zelensky currently is nor legal, neither legal nor legitimate, because, as you know, he is in fact is not legally in the right position of being able to speak for Ukraine at this stage. The Speaker of the Parliament, in fact, should be the right interlocutor for Russia. So, first of all, we need to solve this legal problem. In addition to the fact that I remind you that in October 2022, Zelensky issued a decree preventing himself to talk to the Russians as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. So, meaning that there are a couple of legal issues that need to be solved in order to have a discussion which is legally valid. Legally valid. I'm not talking of politically valid, but legally valid, because if you start anything at this stage just tomorrow with the Ukrainians, you may never know if what you decide will be legally binding or not. So that's the first aspect. The second point is probably more political. I said before that on the 25th of February, 2022, Zelensky called the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs to have a peace conference. And eventually, what happened in this first round of negotiation, the European Union came and said, no, there is no discussion with Vladimir Putin. Here is money for weapons, but there is no way you will talk to the Russians. In March, April 2022, you had exactly the same scenario. Zelensky made proposal to the Russians, and you had this discussion in Istanbul. They almost reached an agreement, and at this point, Boris Johnson came and said, "No way, you don't talk to Vladimir Putin." And in fact, that's where Zelensky traded peace for unlimited support from the West, and that's the reason why he's still asking for support, because this support was promised in April 2022. And the same happened in August 2022, when a summit was about to be organized under the auspices of Erdogan of Turkey. And Vladimir Putin accepted, but then Boris Johnson came again and said, "No way." So the problem for the Russians is political. If you have somebody to talk to, how long this negotiation will last? Because at the end of the day, the Europeans, especially the Europeans in this case, can interrupt the process. So why would you start a negotiation process if any European leaders come up and says no way to continue? And that's why, in fact, the Russians would not be unhappy to talk to the Americans, because they know that the Americans are the only one who have the necessary leverage to oblige both the Ukrainians and the Europeans to implement what has been decided. The problem is that, and there I agree with History Legend, they don't want the European, and I suspect that Trump would be probably a little bit in that direction, that what the Russians don't want is that the US dictates what a peace should be. And that's the problem. And that's not what the Russians want. Again, if there is any negotiation, there will be on Russian terms and not on US terms. And that, I think, is a very fundamental discussion. So the Russians will not reject the US outright, but they don't want the US to impose a U.S. solution.
Yeah, and in fact, we had a piece out just this morning by Russian ambassador. I always get his name mixed up there. Gadilov, where he says, "Yeah, we're open to talk, but any talk has to be based on the conditions, realities on the ground, and that doesn't just mean, which some people interpreted to mean the current line of contact, like where the listens are now. But I think back to your comment a minute ago, back to the June 15 lines or minimum acceptance to enter negotiations. And I think that's where you're going to get a big problem, is that if Trump's going to want to go in there and get a big win for him domestically by having something along the current lines frozen, but Russia has a different viewpoint of where the start point is. And I think that's where we're going to have some challenges.
Absolutely. And I think the Russians, in fact, have always indicated they're ready to talk. In fact, there is no occasion where they refused to have any kind of negotiation. And the only probably I should probably make just a comment on the issue of Kursk, because for the Russians, Kursk will not be subject to any kind of negotiation. The Ukrainians have to be out of the Russian territory. There's no negotiation about this. Yeah. So that's why the calculation of Volodymyr Zelensky to have some kind of bargaining chip with Kursk is basically a misunderstanding of how the Russians understand things. But the Russians have always been favorable of negotiation. And if we look at what the population thinks, and if I can show here a poll of made by the Levada Center. The Levada Center, for those who don't know, is considered as it's based in Moscow, but it's considered as a foreign agent in Russia. So it's partly funded by the US. So and it's interesting here to see. This is every month they make a kind of a survey about the willingness to negotiate or to continue the war, and we see that this in the last couple of months, we see that the population is increasingly favorable to a negotiation, and the willingness to continue the military operation is slightly fading. And if we see how the people support the military, the special military operation, and here we see the Kursk offensive as just as a marker, we see that the support is still very high, but still it's probably a little bit fading, because there is probably some kind of fatigue among the Russian population, and we can understand that. With that, and that explains why the Russians have never rejected any possibility of negotiation. The problem, again, as you just rightly pointed out, the problem is that such a negotiation must be on Russian terms, because that reflects the reality on the ground, and must not be on European or US terms. And,
yeah, or correct me if I'm wrong, if we try to make it on that, Russia simply is going to say, no, there's no terms on that. We'll just keep going with our methodical push.
Exactly.
Right?
Precisely. And we are exactly in one of the scenarios that I just exposed before.
Yeah.
So meaning that at the end, the fact, and it's interesting, because if Boris Johnson had not prevented the completion of the agreement in March, I mean, Ukraine would be almost as it was in 2014.
Yeah.
So we see that the influence and the intervention of the West in this conflict has been consistently detrimental to Ukraine. And in fact, what we are witnessing today is, in fact, we are going exactly in the same direction. And I think at the end of the day, the only option for the Russians, if there is no negotiation, is the total destruction of Ukraine, in fact.
Yeah, that's it. That's how I see it militarily. So that's why I'm a huge advocate that the Trump administration needs to come in and do things very different diplomatically. But there's an additional challenge with that too, aside from the issue with Trump and Putin themselves. But it's also a matter of who's going to be doing the negotiating. So at least in the United States, there's two key players, or actually there's three: National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, because those are Trump's primary, by statute, his primary advisors on when he's making decisions. And I want to look just a little bit at some of the people that are at least have been nominated to fill those roles by Trump, and then compare them with who they'll be negotiating with on the other side. So first of all, I want to start off with Secretary of Defense. Pete Hegseth has been put forward by Trump, and he'll be going against Bela Usov, which we'll talk about in a second. But first of all, here is a quote or a piece of an interview by Hegseth just about a week or so ago.
Are you concerned about nuclear war?
I mean, yes, in a general sense, I guess. I found overinflated from the beginning this idea that Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine was going to lead to nuclear war or war across the continent. I've always felt like it was, from the beginning, like a couple days in, I was like, this feels like a Putin's give me my shit back war. It kind of feels like, I feel like you've been pushing pretty hard, and we used to have the former Soviet Union, and we're pretty proud of that. And Ukraine was a part of it, and all these other countries, and I want my shit back. And I think I'm at the right time where I'm powerful enough to do it, and you're not quite on my border yet, and Biden's AWOL, so I'm going for it. And just like I did under my minor incursion under Obama, I got what I could, I got Crimea, now I waited under Trump, now I'm gonna get my, and this idea that I hear all the time, and I've friends who would probably agree with us on most things. They're like, well, if you don't stop him in Ukraine, then he's gonna go all the way to Poland, and he's going, I don't think he's, I mean, maybe in a perfect world where he had unlimited capabilities and he could crown himself king of Europe, he would. I think he's probably knows enough to know that it's probably not going much further than Ukraine.
So with that as the mentality, how do you figure that if you know, especially in terms of whether or not he would be doing anything against Bela Usov, and as you mentioned before we came on the air, it's a little different in the Russian system about the Secretary of Defense, but with that mentality advising Trump, how would that play in a negotiation to try to end this?
Well, I think this idea of having a general war triggered by that may happen if you have all the mechanisms that are within the NATO system, Article 5 and all that. That may eventually lead to something. And if we hear to some small nations such as the Baltic states or Poland, even then Poland has been more moderate in the recent weeks, but the Baltic states are extremely vocal and extremely aggressive and all that. Well, if you listen to them, well, we probably that can lead to a major conflict. But I think the Russians have the thing very well under control, and there is, from the Russian side, I don't see any willingness to have something that goes beyond the conventional type of conflict we have seen since about 2 years and a half. And I think there is absolutely, as opposed to what we have said, I have heard in France, the French foreign minister just said that Europe is threatened by Russia and all that. I think this is a fantasy. The Russians have very clear objectives. We can argue on that. We have discussed that many times, but these objectives are limited to Ukraine and the Ukrainian territory, and probably not even the whole of the Ukrainian territory. So we have to keep it that way. Otherwise, I think, and probably that's what I think the new administration might probably come with some expectations that are probably a little bit more realistic on that sense than.
So I think probably the biggest area of vulnerability for the United States and the biggest disadvantage we have is in any kind of negotiations, it's going to be led by the State Department or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Russian side. And that is, you have Lavrov, who is about as experienced as any foreign minister in modern history of any country has been in position for so long and is really, really knowledgeable and excellent, really, at foreign affairs. On the other side, we have someone less so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
I'm sorry,
that's
Gary, if you can play that, role of the role of Secretary of State Rubio designate.
Yeah. Israel has killed Hezbollah, confirming its leader Hassan Nasrallah. Israel used a U.S.-made 2,000-pound bomb in the strike that killed him. You are vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Yeah, Gary, actually, if you can pull that one out, I was looking for the one that you were going to play in your browser. I think the one where he's talking about the Ukraine war.
Okay.
Sorry, we'll pull up a different one here. Here we go.
Okay. Yeah.
Just to be clear, would you be comfortable accepting the current lines of demarcation as Senator Vance seems to be?
I would be comfortable with a deal that ends these hostilities and that I think is favorable to Ukraine, meaning that they have their own sovereignty, that they don't become a satellite state or a puppet state that is constantly held hostage by the Russians.
Is that a no, Senator? Is that a no?
Is that a what?
Is that a no?
Well, I'm not going to prejudge any agreement. I will tell you, the Ukrainians don't want to live in a country where the Russians dominate their territorial, for example, Crimea. What's the future of Crimea? The Russians claim it. Obviously, they stole it back in 2014 in the first invasion. You'll have to ask the Obama people why that happened under their watch. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what the most important thing here is that these hostilities end and that Ukraine can go back to rebuilding its economy and people can move back. Millions of people have had to leave that country. It's been devastating to them.
That's good, Gary. That's you see that. I mean, his mentality is like really just taking all those maps that you put up there earlier and just saying, yeah, I don't think that that's going to be the case. So I want this map, like maybe the one at the beginning, or even the one in 2022, and that's just not on the table. And if you enter negotiations thinking it is, I mean, what do you expect from the Russian side?
Well, what you said before is absolutely right. I mean, when we have on the one side, on the Russian side, you have seasoned foreign ministers and a whole apparatus that is very much experienced and all that. On the other hand, I mean, we had this also with the first mandate of President Trump with Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo and all that, who are in fact casual foreign ministers and not very experienced in foreign ministry. They may have some ideas, but they are guided or driven by some kind of ideology, and they have a poor knowledge of what happened. And that's very much the case with what just Senator Rubio said about Crimea. Of course, I know this is the common understanding in the West that Crimea was stolen by the Russians, but I remind you that there has never been any invasion of Crimea, that most of in fact, the Ukrainian soldiers, the garrison that was there was 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers on the peninsula. They almost all of them, I mean 20,000 of them, defected to the Russians. And we have also something some people forget, which is, I think, very important, is that in 1991, 1991, you had a referendum as the USSR was still active. And in that referendum, the Crimean population decided to be detached from Ukraine and to become the autonomous socialist Republic of Crimea. And they were detached from Kiev, and they were under the leadership of Moscow directly. And 6 months later, Ukraine became independent, but Ukraine refused this situation and still tried to keep Crimea within Ukraine. And they kept this status of an autonomous Ukraine for a couple of years. And in 1995, Ukraine annexed Crimea And if you look at the Constitution of 1996, you don't see any mention of Crimea anymore because it was illegally annexed. The president
I
of
actually was not aware of
Crimea was toppled, and the Constitution of Crimea was abolished by Kiev forcefully. And that's why the Crimean population comes back always to the referendum of 1991. And in 2014, as they had the opportunity, based on the changes of regime in Kiev, the population asked for a new referendum. And based on that referendum, they tasked the authorities of Crimea to ask to join the Russian Federation. And the Russian Federation accepted this. So legally speaking, we can really argue on that. And in my view, just based on the legal realities from 1991 up to 2014, I would suggest that Crimea, in my view, has more legitimacy to be Russian than Kosovo to be independent, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Then so I can assure you that there's virtually nobody in the West, in the United States especially, that is even aware of that history there prior to 2014 with Crimea. Listen, in the amount of time we have left here, we keep talking about realities on the ground. I want to real quick look at some of the military situation on the ground and some of the most important parts. And this is the Pokrovsk area in the southern part of the front. Let me back out so people can see where we're at here. This is along the southern or the eastern front, around the central part of it. And this Pokrovsk area here, Russia had been making an effort that they took Avdiivka right here. They had been moving directly toward Pokrovsk, and then they started moving more to the flanks here, and then some more down here in the southern part, as opposed to keeping to going here toward the much more defended Pokrovsk area. I wonder if you can talk a little about why that is.
Well, I think the problem is that this pocket that you have just south of this Ukrainian pocket in the Russian lines are probably considered by the Russians as a possible threat. So they prefer to straighten the front line and to remove that pocket before going into Pokrovsk, because once they are in Pokrovsk, in fact, if you look at how the Russians tend to address urban warfare, they don't go directly in the cities. They try to go on both sides of the city and to squeeze the city between the two. I don't have the term right now in English. But and in Pokrovsk, they are too vulnerable, I think, in the current configuration.
Yeah,
so
that's exactly what they did with Selidova. I don't know if our viewers remember. Instead of just coming straight into Selidova, they actually made a stronghold here, kind of a holding position, and then they rolled up both flanks until they had it surrounded.
Exactly. This is exactly that. And if you look, in fact, since even in 2014, even the rebels of the two republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, in fact, achieved their victory in the same way. This is almost a standard procedure for the Russians. And a lot of officers of the Lugansk and Donetsk Republic used to be militaries and young officers in the Soviet army at the time. And in fact, they applied exactly the same tactics. And this idea, if you look at what happened in Debaltsevo, for instance, and that's in fact the battle that led to the Minsk agreement, because that was a defeat of the Ukrainians. It happened exactly the same way. They went on both sides of the city, and then once they controlled, they encircled almost completely the city, then they squeezed in the city and they achieved the victory. And that's how they achieve most of their victories. So that's why they will not go straight. I mean, again, I'm not in the planning room, in the, in the,
Yeah.
in
But just based on what they've been doing.
Well, I think that's why they will wait until they have this line of this front line straightened, and they have removed all the vulnerable points. They don't want to be in the same situation as the Ukrainians in Kursk. You see that they are completely encircled, and that this is a very strange situation. By the way, I think in Kursk it's interesting because the Russians, they obviously they don't want to accelerate the movement, and some ask why they keep they stay so long before having the final assault against the Ukrainians. I think the explanation is that Kursk and this small territory, Russian territory held by the Ukrainians, is more important for Ukraine as it is for Russia. Therefore, we see that Ukraine is injecting new troops and the best troops in that small areas, and the Russians keep crushing these troops, and that weakens, in fact, the rest of the front line. And that's the reason why the Russians have understood that as long as they keep this area, the Ukrainians will inject.
Yeah, you get more troops and then continue to have to send reinforcements and also the supplies in there, which is one of the reasons why it's literally an abscess, and it's just a hole that's sucking down troops. We seem to have. Oh, there we go. We got you back there.
Oh, sorry. The Russians have perfectly understood the mechanical aspect, and they are playing with that. In fact, they are playing with the Ukrainians at this stage, and the Ukrainians are simply weakening the rest of the front line, given the importance of course, because
right. So let me ask you a question then, because that's militarily, I mean, even tactically, that just makes no sense to me at this point why Ukraine would keep their troops in there. I mean, because they have to be aware more than anyone how much that's draining on their logistic supplies, on their reinforcements, on their equipment, et cetera, and how it's weakening the areas they could be sending them to down here. Why do you think that the Ukrainian side won't withdraw those forces?
Because they still consider that having a piece of Russian territory could be a bargaining chip if there is any discussion. I think this is the only asset they have in a negotiation, because
you know that there is no asset. Putin will never negotiate with that.
I understand that, and if we look at it from our point of view, this is definitely a mistake. But and the problem is that I think the Ukrainian military have understood that. The problem is that Zelensky doesn't want to understand that, and that's the problem, because he sees that more political value to this territory, this small territory, and that's a real problem. And that's something, interestingly enough, if you look at the way the war was conducted on the Russian side and Ukrainian side, you could say that on the Russian side you have a pure military command and control of the operations. That comes from Gerasimov, from the head of the general staff. He is also the commander of this theater of operation. Ukraine is a Teatr Voyennych Действий. That means a theater of operation, and that is led by military people. While on the Ukrainian side, you have a political command and control, because at the end of the day, Zelensky plays the role of the commander-in-chief, and even above, and that's why he had argument with Zaluzhny, and he had to move him to London, and he has now problem with Syrskyi, because these guys are military. They understand the problems on the ground, the military realities. And while Zelensky, he sees the political realities. And for him, what is important for Zelensky is to have the support from the West. And having Kursk is for him a way to say to the Europeans, we are able to reach over the Russian territory. And in fact, even say recently that he is ready to do other Kursk operations. So meaning that for him, this is more a way to address the West and to convince the West to continue to support and provide funding and weapons and all that, because he still have the Ukrainians still have this offensive capability. But the problem is that we know that this is just a show, because he has a tiny piece of territory. He's not able to keep that territory. And at the end of the day, he is spending a lot of resources for a minimal operational and strategic success. So this is the problem.
It is, and it's. I think it's going to eventually degrade into an existential one that cannot be recovered from at some point. But listen, we'll leave it there for the moment. We'll keep on tracking this and watching as it goes, especially as we get closer to when the Trump administration actually takes control. And then we'll see what happens with these negotiations. We've talked about them now, and we'll continue to lean on your expertise and to see how things go as they develop. Thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
And we appreciate you guys too. And as always, be sure and like and subscribe if you hadn't. Also, to make sure you know, we are on podcast now, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Just go and type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us there waiting for you. Appreciate you guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.